I couldn't hear a sound, but my dog was suddenly thrashing on the floor, clawing at his ears until they bled as if struck by an invisible whip. Outside, green lights glowed in the darkness, and a man in a parked car just checked his watch, waiting for me to break under the silent torture. Before we continue and find out how it all began, please subscribe and leave a like. We'd truly love to read your comments below. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the founder's cottage. The late afternoon sun cast long amber shadows over the manicured lawns of the Evergreen Foundation. For 20 years I had built this institution from a single brick into a national leader in environmental advocacy. Now I lived here as a quiet guest in the margins of my own history. The non-disclosure agreement I signed 3 years ago felt like a velvet gag. It kept me silent while others took credit for my vision. I watched a group of young interns walk past the rose bushes in their crisp white shirts. They did not even glance at my door. To them, I was just a retired woman in a gray cardigan. Barnaby rested his heavy, warm head on my slipper. He was a 12-year-old golden retriever with cloudy eyes and a heart of gold. His breathing was slow and rhythmic. It was the only sound in the room. I reached down to scratch the soft fur behind his graying ears. Barnaby had been with me since the first fundraising gala in a drafty warehouse. He was my only witness to the long nights of work and the early days of struggle. His hips were stiff from years of chasing tennis balls. He required daily medication and a familiar environment to stay comfortable. He was the last piece of my old life that still had a heartbeat. I moved to the small kitchen to prepare his evening meal. I carefully measured out the expensive kibble and added the crushed tablets for his joints. The kitchen was modern and sterile. It lacked the warmth of the home I had shared with my late husband. Every appliance was top of the line and provided by the foundation. It was a comfortable cage. I placed the bowl on the floor and watched Barnaby eat. He moved with a slow, dignified grace. He was the reason I stayed in this cottage despite the isolation. I had promised him a peaceful retirement on the grounds he loved so much. A sharp, authoritative knock at the door broke the stillness of the room. I opened it to find a young man in a crisp delivery uniform. He held a tablet in one hand and a thick manila envelope in the other. The envelope bore the foundation's official gold-embossed seal. My name was printed on the front in stark black ink. I signed the digital screen and thanked him. He gave a quick professional nod and turned away. The paper felt heavy and unexpectedly cold in my hands. I walked back to my desk and used a silver letter opener to slice the top of the envelope. Inside was a formal memorandum from the board of directors. It was signed by Marcus Thorne. He was the man I had once mentored as a promising young lawyer with a sharp mind. Now he was the chair of the board and the face of the new Evergreen. The document was titled New Residential Safety and Property Maintenance Guidelines. I scanned the lines of dense bureaucratic text. My eyes stopped at Section 4 near the bottom of the page. It stated that all residents of the foundation grounds were prohibited from keeping large animals. Any pet over 25 pounds was deemed a liability to the historic property. Barnaby weighed nearly 80 pounds of pure loyalty. The memo gave me exactly 30 days to comply with the new regulation. Failure to do so would result in a formal breach of my residency contract. I felt a heavy knot of dread tighten in my chest. This was not about safety or property values or insurance premiums. This was a direct strike at the only thing I had left to love. Marcus knew exactly what he was doing with this pen stroke. He knew I would never abandon the dog that had stayed by my side through every crisis. He was forcing me to choose between my home and my heart. I looked at Barnaby as he finished his meal and walked to his favorite rug. Marcus knew that my residency was tied to my absolute silence. If I fought this publicly, I would lose my pension and my health care. If I left quietly, I would be admitting that he had finally erased me from the foundation. The cruelty of the move was calculated and precise. It was the kind of ruthless strategy I had once taught Marcus myself. He was using my own lessons to destroy my peace. He wanted me gone so he could finally stop living in my shadow. I decided to walk to the main administrative building before the business day ended. The gravel crunched under my sensible shoes as I approached the glass and steel structure. I had designed this building to blend in with the forest. Now it looked like a fortress of corporate power. I entered the lobby where my portrait used to hang in a place of honor. It had been replaced by a massive digital screen. The screen showed a loop of Marcus's recent media appearances on national news. I asked the receptionist if Marcus was available for a brief word. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and professional discomfort. She told me he was in a budget meeting but could see me for 5 minutes. I waited in the hallway on a sleek leather bench. I felt like a ghost haunting the halls I had once commanded. Every corner of this building held a memory of a hard-won victory. I remembered the night we secured the first $1 million grant in that conference room. Now the staff walked past me with their eyes fixed on their smartphones. They did not see the woman who had made their careers possible. They only saw a relic of a previous era that was no longer relevant. Marcus's office was larger and more opulent than mine had ever been. He sat behind a massive desk made of reclaimed oak that cost more than a small car. He did not stand up or offer a hand when I entered the room. He gestured to a hard guest chair and checked his gold watch with a frown. He looked at me with a practiced smile that stayed far away from his eyes. He asked how I was enjoying the quiet life in the cottage. I placed the memorandum on his desk without a word. I told him that Barnaby was too old and frail to be moved. I reminded him that the dog had been a fixture of the foundation for a decade. Marcus leaned back in his ergonomic chair and sighed. He looked like a man burdened by the weight of difficult responsibilities. He told me that the board had to think about the future of the institution. He said that the insurance premiums for the historic grounds were rising at an alarming rate. He claimed that large animals posed a significant risk to the delicate landscape and the new gardens. His voice was smooth and professional. It was the tone of a man who had already decided the outcome. He suggested that I find a nice farm for Barnaby in the countryside. He even offered to help me pay for a professional boarding service for a few months. I realized then that there was no room for negotiation or human empathy. He wanted me to choose between my loyalty to my dog and my place in this community. He was testing my resolve and my willingness to remain silent. I stood up and took the memorandum back from his desk. I did not raise my voice or show any sign of the anger burning inside me. I thanked him for his time and walked out. I felt the heavy silence of the staff on me as I left the building. They knew about the new policy and they knew about Barnaby. They were waiting to see if the founder would finally break under the pressure. I walked back to the cottage in the fading purple light of the evening. Barnaby was waiting for me at the door with a wagging tail. The thud of it against the dark wood floor sounded like a steady drum. I sat on the porch steps and pulled his large head into my lap. I realized that Marcus had made a catastrophic mistake. He thought I was a tired old woman who had forgotten how to fight. He believed that my silence was a sign of weakness. I spent the rest of the evening in my small, cramped library. I pulled down the original bylaws of the Evergreen Foundation from the top shelf. I had written them myself on a kitchen table 20 years ago. The leather-bound folders were covered in a thin gray layer of dust. I began to read every single word of the founding charter. I looked for the specific language regarding the use of the grounds and the rights of the residents. Marcus thought he was the master of the rules now. He forgot that I was the one who had built the labyrinth he was trying to use against me. I took out a fresh legal pad and started making detailed notes. I cross-referenced the residency agreement with the federal tax status of the foundation. My mind began to move with the old precision that had built an empire. The battle for Barnaby was just the beginning of a much larger reckoning. I looked at the dog sleeping at my feet and felt a cold, sharp clarity. Marcus Thorne was about to learn that some foundations are deeper than others. The next morning, a thick gray fog rolled off the Atlantic and smothered the foundation grounds. I sat at my small kitchen table with 3 different versions of the foundation's charter spread out before me. The original 2005 document was clear about the residency rights of the founder. It granted me a lifetime lease on the cottage and full access to all campus facilities. I highlighted the phrase, unencumbered use of the grounds with a yellow marker. Marcus Thorne had replaced the 2005 version with a heavily amended 2022 edition. In his version, my rights were reclassified as discretionary privileges, subject to the board's annual review. I reached out to Elias, the director of operations. He had started as an intern in my second year and had always been a loyal friend. I sent him a brief professional email asking for a private meeting at the campus coffee shop. 2 hours passed without a response. I checked my sent folder to ensure the message had gone through. Then I noticed a small red icon at the bottom of my screen. My access to the internal foundation server had been restricted to read-only status. Marcus was already cutting the digital threads that connected me to the organization I had built. I walked to the campus coffee shop anyway. It was a modern glass-walled building that overlooked the central pond. I saw Elias sitting at a corner table with a tablet and a stack of blueprints. He looked up as I approached and his face instantly paled. He did not stand up or offer the warm greeting I expected. He looked around the room to see who was watching us. 2 of Marcus's new compliance officers were standing by the espresso machine. They were young men in tactical-style polo shirts with security embroidered on the sleeves. Elias leaned in and spoke in a hurried whisper. He told me that Marcus had held a staff meeting that morning. The message was clear. Any employee caught assisting me in my contractual dispute would face immediate termination for cause. Elias said he had a mortgage and 2 kids in private school. He pushed a folded piece of paper across the table toward me. He told me he couldn't talk anymore and gathered his things. He walked out of the shop without looking back. I felt a cold wave of abandonment wash over me. I opened the note under the table. It was a printout of a new internal memo. Marcus had authorized a grounds restoration project that would begin on Monday. The project involved installing high-frequency acoustic barriers around the administrative buildings to deter wildlife and unauthorized animals. These barriers were known to cause intense physical distress to dogs. Marcus wasn't just trying to evict Barnaby through paperwork. He was preparing to make the very air on the grounds painful for him. My hands shook as I folded the paper and tucked it into my pocket. When I returned to the cottage, Barnaby did not greet me at the door. I found him in the living room, struggling to stand up. His back legs were shaking and his breathing was shallow. I realized I had missed his noon dose of anti-inflammatory medication. I went to the cabinet where I kept his prescription bottles. There was only 1 pill left in the orange plastic vial. I had planned to refill the prescription at the Foundation's on-site infirmary as I had done for years. It was a benefit included in my residency package to save me the long drive into the city. I put Barnaby in the back of my old SUV and drove to the infirmary. The building was a small brick structure near the employee housing. I walked to the pharmacy window and handed the empty vial to the technician. She looked at the label and then at her computer screen. She told me that the infirmary was no longer authorized to dispense medications for non-resident animals. I explained that Barnaby had been a resident for 10 years. She pointed to a new sign on the glass. It stated that all veterinary services were strictly limited to the Foundation's official K9 security team. I asked to speak with the head nurse, but she refused to come to the window. The security guard at the door stepped closer to me. He placed his hand on his belt and told me I was obstructing the flow of the clinic. I looked through the glass at the shelves of medication that Barnaby needed to walk without pain. They were only 20 feet away, but they were now behind a wall of rigid bureaucracy. I walked back to my car and sat in the driver's seat. Barnaby let out a soft, pained whine from the cargo area. I had to drive 40 miles to the nearest 24-hour veterinary pharmacy in the city. The traffic on the interstate was heavy and the rain began to fall in sheets. By the time I returned with the medication, it was after 8 in the evening. As I pulled into the driveway of the cottage, I saw a white van parked in front of my door. 3 men in blue jumpsuits were offloading crates of equipment. A large sign had been hammered into my small front lawn. It read, "Site of future acoustic barrier installation. Authorized personnel only." I confronted the foreman of the crew. He was a burly man with a clipboard who didn't seem to care about my history. He told me they had orders to begin the electrical wiring for the barriers immediately. He said they would be working through the night to meet Marcus's deadline. The noise of the industrial drills began to echo through the trees. Barnaby cowered in the back of the SUV, his ears pinned back against his head. The vibration from the machinery was already visible in the puddles on the ground. I led Barnaby into the house and closed all the windows. The sound of the drilling still penetrated the walls. I moved his bed into the center of the library, which was the most insulated room in the cottage. I sat on the floor with him and fed him his medication hidden in a piece of cheese. He was trembling so hard that I could feel it through the floorboards. Every drill bit that sank into the earth felt like it was boring into my own skull. Marcus was testing how much pain I could watch my dog endure before I surrendered. I turned on my laptop to research the legal requirements for these acoustic barriers. My internet connection was gone. I checked the router and saw that the service light was a steady, mocking red. I tried to use my phone as a hotspot, but the signal was strangely weak. I realized Marcus had installed a signal jammer on the nearby utility pole. He was systematically cutting me off from the outside world. He wanted me trapped in a silent, vibrating box with a suffering animal. He wanted to break my spirit by morning. I spent the rest of the night by candlelight. I used a physical dictionary and my old legal textbooks to draft a formal notice of harassment. I wrote by hand, my pen scratching against the paper in the dim light. I cited the original 2005 safety standards for the grounds. I argued that the acoustic barriers violated the quiet enjoyment clause of my residency. I knew Marcus would laugh at the document, but I needed to create a paper trail. I needed to prove that I had tried to resolve this within the system. At 3 in the morning, the drilling finally stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and unnatural. I walked to the window and saw the crew packing up their van. They had installed a series of small gray pylons every 10 feet along my property line. Each pylon had a glowing blue LED light. I knew that when those lights turned green, the high-frequency sound would begin. It would be a sound I couldn't hear, but it would be a nightmare for Barnaby. I looked at the dog and saw that he had finally fallen into a fitful sleep. I realized then that Marcus Thorne was not just an ambitious man. He was a man who enjoyed the process of dismantling another human being. He had taken my mentorship and turned it into a weapon. He believed that my love for Barnaby was my greatest weakness. He thought he could use it to force me to sign away my legacy. I looked at the yellow highlighter marks on my founding charter. I saw a small overlooked clause in the environmental impact section. It was a rule I had written to protect the local bird population. The clause prohibited any high-frequency electronic devices within 500 yards of the protected nesting grounds. My cottage was located exactly 300 yards from the Great Blue Heron Sanctuary. Marcus was so focused on hurting me that he had forgotten the environmental laws he was supposed to uphold. I felt a cold, sharp spark of hope in my chest. I didn't need a lawyer or a server connection to fight back. I just needed the very rules Marcus claimed to be protecting. I began to plan my next move as the first light of dawn touched the fog. At 7 in the morning, the blue LED lights on the gray pylons turned a steady, piercing green. I did not hear a sound, but Barnaby reacted as if he had been struck by an invisible whip. He let out a sharp, high-pitched yelp and scrambled to his feet. He began to pace frantically in small circles, his claws clicking against the hardwood floor. He pawed at his ears until his skin was red and raw. I rushed to him and tried to cover his head with a heavy wool blanket. He was trembling so violently that his teeth rattled. The high-frequency waves were invisible to me, but they were tearing through his nervous system. I tried to call the local animal control office using the landline in the kitchen. I picked up the receiver and heard only a flat, dead silence. Marcus had not just cut the internet. He had physically severed the phone line outside the house. I felt a sickening wave of panic rise in my throat. I was 64 years old and trapped in a house that had become a torture chamber for my best friend. I looked out the window and saw a white sedan parked at the end of the driveway. A man in a dark suit sat inside, watching the cottage. He was not a security guard. He was a witness waiting for me to break. I decided to bypass Marcus and go directly to Mrs. Eleanor Gable. She was the oldest member of the board and a woman who had once called me her closest friend. I knew she was staying at the Foundation's guest manor for the weekend. I loaded Barnaby into the SUV and drove across the campus. The dog was huddled on the floorboards, whimpering with every inch we traveled. I pulled up to the manor and saw Eleanor sitting on the veranda. She was sipping tea and reading the Sunday paper. She looked the picture of aristocratic peace in her pearls and silk scarf. I walked up the stone steps, my heart hammering against my ribs. I did not wait for an invitation. I told her about the acoustic barriers and the 30-day eviction notice for Barnaby. I told her that Marcus was violating the core ethics of the Foundation. Eleanor did not look surprised. She did not even put down her teacup. She looked at me with a chilling, distant pity that was worse than anger. She said that Marcus had presented a very convincing case to the board. She claimed that my emotional instability was becoming a liability to their new fundraising goals. Eleanor leaned forward and her voice became a sharp, icy whisper. She told me that the board had already voted to support Marcus in all operational adjustments. She said that if I made a scene, they would move to have me declared mentally incompetent. They had a file of my erratic behavior, including my recent unauthorized visits to staff members. I realized then that the board was not being misled. They were active participants in my erasure. They wanted the prestige of the Foundation without the burden of the founder's conscience. The last illusion of a safe exit vanished. I drove toward the Great Blue Heron Sanctuary at the edge of the property. I needed to see the nesting grounds to confirm the environmental violation. As I approached the trailhead, I saw a line of heavy yellow bulldozers idling in the clearing. A large sign was posted on a cedar tree. It announced the Thorn Pavilion and Event Center, a 20,000-square-foot luxury venue. My breath caught in my chest. This was the heart of the sanctuary. Marcus was not just ignoring the bird protection clause. He was physically destroying the very habitat the Foundation was created to protect. I walked past the no trespassing signs toward the marshland. The air was usually filled with the calls of herons and egrets. Now, it was silent. I looked at the ground and saw the crushed remains of nesting sites. The construction crews had already started clearing the brush in direct violation of federal wetland protections. Marcus was gambling that he could finish the project before any federal inspector noticed. He was trading the Foundation's soul for a shiny new monument to his own ego. The new truth hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. I returned to the car and found Barnaby in a state of total collapse. He was panting heavily and his tongue was a dark, bruised purple. The heat in the car was rising and the stress was pushing his old heart to the limit. I realized I could not stay in the cottage another night. I could not watch him suffer while I waited for a legal miracle. I felt a deep, hollow sense of defeat. I began to drive toward the main gate, intending to leave the grounds forever. I would find a hotel in the city and give up my residency. Marcus would win, but Barnaby would be safe. As I reached the gate, the security guard stepped out of the booth and held up a hand. He told me that I was free to leave, but I could not take any Foundation property with me. He pointed to a clause in my original contract. It stated that all equipment and assets acquired during my tenure belonged to the institution. He claimed that because Barnaby's medical care had been subsidized by the Foundation, the dog was technically a corporate asset. He told me I had to leave Barnaby in his care until the board reviewed the matter. The sheer absurdity of the claim broke something inside me. I looked at the guard, then at the man in the white sedan who had followed me to the gate. They were waiting for me to cry or scream. They wanted me to provide the evidence of instability that Eleanor had mentioned. I felt a sudden freezing clarity wash over my mind. The fear evaporated and was replaced by an icy, calculating rage. I realized that Marcus Thorne was not playing a game of rules. He was playing a game of endurance. He expected me to act like a victim. He had forgotten that I was the architect. I put the SUV in reverse and backed away from the gate. I did not leave. I drove back to the founder's cottage with a steady hand on the wheel. I ignored the green lights on the pylons and the vibration in the floorboards. I led Barnaby back into the library and sat on the floor with him. I took out my handwritten notes in the founding charter. I looked at the signature of the federal auditor who had approved our tax-exempt status 15 years ago. I remembered his name and his reputation for being a relentless stickler for the law. I realized that Marcus had made one final arrogant assumption. He believed that because he controlled the campus, he controlled the evidence. He did not know about the secondary archive I had maintained in a secure off-site facility for 2 decades. I had a complete record of every environmental survey and every federal grant application. I had the original unamended maps of the Heron Sanctuary. Marcus was building his pavilion on a foundation of lies and federal crimes. He thought he was burying me, but he was actually digging his own grave. I spent the next 4 hours in the basement of the cottage. I pulled up the floorboards under the old water heater. I retrieved a small waterproof case containing an encrypted satellite phone. I had kept it for emergencies, a relic of my early days working in remote wilderness areas. I stepped out onto the back porch, away from the signal jammers in the utility poles. I dialed a number I had memorized a long time ago. The phone rang 3 times before a gravelly voice answered. It was the regional director of the Environmental Protection Agency. I spoke for 20 minutes, my voice calm and precise. I detailed the destruction of the Heron Sanctuary and the violation of the high-frequency equipment laws. I provided the GPS coordinates of the bulldozers and the specific sections of the federal code Marcus was breaking. I told him that an unauthorized development was currently destroying a protected wetland. I did not mention Barnaby or my residency dispute. I spoke only as a concerned citizen with expert knowledge of the site. The director promised to send a federal enforcement team at sunrise. I went back inside and sat with Barnaby. The green lights on the pylons were still glowing, but I knew their time was limited. I felt a strange, quiet peace. I had reached the lowest point, and I had survived it. I had watched my life's work be desecrated and my dog be tortured. I had been betrayed by my friends and isolated by my enemies. But in the darkness of the cottage, I realized that Marcus Thorne had given me a gift. He had stripped away everything I was afraid to lose. I was no longer a guest in my own history. I was the storm that was coming for him. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the heavy silence of the foundation grounds was broken by the sound of tires on gravel. I stood at my library window and watched 3 black SUVs with federal government plates pull up to the main gate. The green lights on the acoustic pylons were still glowing, but the air felt different. I saw the security guard step out of his booth with a look of pure confusion. He spoke into his radio as 4 men in windbreakers with EPA printed on the back stepped out of the vehicles. They did not wait for permission to enter. They presented a federal warrant and a temporary restraining order. I watched through my binoculars as Marcus Thorne emerged from the administrative building in his silk pajamas. He looked frantic as he waved his arms and pointed toward the construction site of his pavilion. One of the federal agents ignored him and began taking soil samples near the pylon line. Another agent walked toward the heron sanctuary with a specialized decibel meter. Marcus tried to block their path, but a local sheriff's deputy stepped between them. The power of Marcus's corporate title meant nothing to a federal inspector with a court order. I felt a deep, quiet hum of satisfaction in my chest. An hour later, the green lights on the pylons finally blinked and died. The high-frequency vibration that had been torturing Barnaby was gone. The dog let out a long, shuddering sigh and rested his head on his paws. His trembling stopped almost instantly. I knelt beside him and felt the tension leave his old muscles. I knew the fight was far from over, but the immediate threat to his life had been neutralized. I spent the rest of the morning dressing in my best navy wool suit. I pinned my original founder's medal to my lapel. It was time for the annual donor appreciation reception. The reception was held under a massive white tent on the central lawn. Marcus had planned to use the event to announce the Thorne Pavilion and secure the final round of funding. I walked toward the tent, feeling the weight of the eyes on me. Word of the federal raid had already spread through the staff. I saw Eleanor Gable standing near the buffet table, her face a mask of rigid anxiety. Marcus was at the center of a circle of wealthy donors, his face flushed and his voice unnaturally loud. He was trying to spin the morning's events as a minor clerical misunderstanding regarding environmental permits. I entered the tent and the room went silent. I did not go to the back or hide in the shadows. I walked straight to the small stage where Marcus stood. He looked at me with a mixture of rage and desperation. He tried to signal for security to remove me, but the guards did not move. They were watching the 2 federal agents who were now standing at the edge of the tent. Marcus had no choice but to acknowledge me. He offered a tight, forced smile and welcomed the founder emerita to the stage. He thought he could control the narrative if he kept me close. Marcus began his speech about the future of the foundation and the importance of the new event center. He spoke about modernizing the legacy and optimizing the grounds. When he finished, he made the mistake of asking if there were any questions from the floor. I stepped to the microphone before anyone else could move. I did not mention the dog or the eviction notice. I did not talk about my personal grievances. I asked him if he had informed the donors that the pavilion was currently under a federal stop work order for felony wetland destruction. The silence in the tent was absolute. Marcus stammered, trying to claim that the environmental impact was within legal limits. I asked my second question with surgical precision. I asked if the board had authorized the use of high-frequency acoustic barriers that violated the Foundation's own 2005 bird protection bylaws. I pointed to the federal auditor who was now standing in the crowd. Marcus realized that every word he spoke was being recorded for a criminal investigation. He looked at the donors, then at the board members, and finally at me. His arrogant facade began to crumble in real time. I turned to the audience and spoke about the original mission of the Evergreen Foundation. I reminded them that our value was not in buildings or pavilions, but in the integrity of the land we protected. I explained that any leader who destroys the very thing they are sworn to protect is a liability to the institution. I saw several major donors whispering to their lawyers. Eleanor Gable stepped away from the stage, her loyalty to Marcus evaporating as she realized the legal risk. The gold boy of the foundation was suddenly a radioactive asset. The reception ended in chaos as donors began to demand the return of their contributions. Marcus was cornered by the federal agents as he tried to leave the tent. He was not arrested, but he was served with a formal subpoena for all internal board communications. By sunset, an emergency meeting of the board of directors was called in the main building. I was not invited, but I didn't need to be. I sat on my porch with Barnaby and watched the lights in the boardroom stay on late into the night. The system was finally purging the poison I had allowed to fester. The next morning, a courier delivered a new envelope to the cottage. It was not a memorandum or a legal threat. It was a formal letter of apology from the board of directors. It stated that Marcus Thorne had been released from his duties, effective immediately. The new residential safety guidelines had been rescinded in their entirety. My residency rights were restored to their original 2005 status. The letter was signed by Eleanor Gable, who was now the acting chair. She had chosen self-preservation over her alliance with Marcus, just as I had predicted. I walked Barnaby down to the Heron Sanctuary that afternoon. The bulldozers were gone, replaced by yellow police tape. The great blue herons were starting to return to the outskirts of the marsh. The damage Marcus had done would take years to repair, but the destruction had stopped. Barnaby walked with a slow but steady gait, his tail wagging as he sniffed the salt air. He was no longer a corporate asset or a liability. He was a dog in his home, and I was a woman who had finally earned her rest. I sat on a weathered bench and watched the sun dip below the horizon. I didn't feel a rush of joy or a need to celebrate. I felt only a profound, quiet peace. I had not broken my non-disclosure agreement. I had not played Marcus's game of petty cruelty. I had simply held up a mirror to his own actions and let the law do the rest. The Evergreen Foundation would survive, but it would never be the same. Neither would I. I reached down and patted Barnaby's side. We were still here, and that was the only victory that mattered. The founder's cottage was silent that evening, but it was a comfortable silence. I deleted the files from my satellite phone and placed it back in its waterproof case. I didn't need to be the CEO or the chair to have power. I just needed to be the person who remembered the rules when everyone else chose to forget them. I watched the stars come out over the sanctuary. The high-frequency pylons were being removed by a different crew on Monday. Marcus Thorne was gone, and the foundation he tried to bury me in was now his own professional tomb.